Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling, well, arguably one of the toughest peaks in modern philosophy, Kant's Transcendental Deduction, specifically the version from the BEdition of the Critique of Pure Reason.
It really is. It's like the Everest of epistemology. And, most people who climb it, they tend to focus on just one side of the mountain, proving how objective knowledge is even possible, the categories.
That's the standard route, definitely. Yeah. How do we get objective validity for concepts like causality or substance? But we're taking a slightly different path today, looking at something scholars like Dieter Henrich really brought to the forefront.
Exactly. We're looking at how the deduction isn't just about validating the categories for objects out there, but it's fundamentally, maybe even primarily, about proving the unity and persistence of the self, the I think.
So it's an identity deduction as much as anything else. It's about the architecture of the self that makes thinking possible in the first place.
Precisely. How can I know myself as the same thinker across different thoughts, different moments? Because if the thinking self isn't stable, then objective knowledge, which requires holding thoughts together, kind of falls apart too.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
So our mission today, figure out the logical groundwork for a self that can unify thoughts and make judgments. Kant kicks this off in section 16, right, with a really basic but profound condition.
He does. It's the absolute baseline. Kant sees the thought, I think, must be able to accompany all my representations, every single one, your idea of red, your memory of breakfast, your understanding of quantum physics.
If that connection isn't possible, if I can't potentially attach I think to a representation,
then in Kant's stark phrasing, that representation is nothing for me. It might as well not exist, cognitively speaking. It drops out of the realm of meaningful thought.
It's interesting, he's not saying the sensation disappears, is he? It's the thinking part that requires this connection.
Exactly right. Think about that sea sponge analogy you sometimes hear. The sponge is sitting there, maybe a hot current washes over it. It feels the heat, no doubt. The sensation is real.
But it can't think this water is hot.
No, because thinking requires distinguishing the self, the I, having the experience from the representation itself, the heat, and from the object, the water. Thinking involves ascribing the thought to a thinker. The sponge lacks that self-awareness, that reflective step.
So the I think isn't just passive awareness, it's an active, reflective capacity needed for judgment. Okay, but this immediately lands us in hot water, philosophically speaking, especially after Hume.
Oh, absolutely, because Kant needs this, I think, to be one and the same self, right? Universal, stable, identical across all thoughts. But when we look at ourselves empirically...
Yeah, when I look at myself, I see moods changing, thoughts drifting, physical sensations coming and going, my hand's typing now, the memory of lunch. It's all flux. Kant calls it dispersed, which sounds right.
It is dispersed. And that empirical self, the one we experience moment to moment, it just doesn't have the goods. It lacks the simplicity, the absolute stable identity needed to be the anchor for all possible representations. It changes too much.
And here's the kicker, right? The representation I, just the bare concept I, it has no content of its own, no features. Hume famously said when he looked inward, he just found particular perceptions, heat, cold, love, hate. Never just a simple, persisting I.
Exactly. How do you prove this I thinking now is the same I that thought a moment ago if the I itself has no distinguishing marks? It's like trying to identify the same invisible point in space over time.
So that's the puzzle Kant has to solve in the deduction. How do we get this necessary identical I think without relying on the messy empirical self and without being able to point to any inherent content in the I itself?
And the solution, Kant argues, lies in shifting our perspective entirely. We have to stop thinking of the self as a thing we observe and start seeing it as a necessary activity. It's about the how, not just the what.
Okay, so we're moving into the core mechanics now. Apperception and synthesis. Section 15 seems pretty central here.
It is. Kant makes a fundamental point. Analysis, taking concepts apart, always presupposes synthesis, putting things together. You can't analyze dog into mammal, four-legged, etc., unless you've first somehow combined those features, along with sensory input, into the unified concept dog.
So combination comes first.
Yeah.
And combination itself needs something more basic.
It needs a prior unity. All synthesis, all acts of combining representations require an underlying unity in the consciousness that performs the combining. Otherwise, it's just scattered data, not a combined thought.
Right. And this is where Kant introduces a really subtle but crucial distinction between different kinds of unity and self-consciousness.
Yes, absolutely critical. He distinguishes original apperception from the identity of apperception. It sounds technical, but the difference is philosophically huge.
Okay, break that down for us. What's the difference? Why does it matter so much?
Well, original apperception is the raw, immediate spontaneity. It's the act of the understanding that generates the I think itself. It's the simple fact that a thought is mine, occurring now. It implies synthesis is happening, but it isn't yet reflective.
It's like the engine running, the basic function.
Sort of, yes. But the identity of apperception is something more. It's the awareness that the I running the engine now is the same I that was running it a moment ago, processing different thoughts. This identity isn't the starting point, it's an achievement. It comes from being conscious of the act of synthesis.
Ah, I see. So original apperception is the immediate I'm thinking, while the identity is the recognition. This thinking I is the same one that thought that. It's a result of reflecting on the process.
Precisely. The identity is constructed, or at least recognized, through awareness of the unifying activity itself. And Kant really digs into this in that famous footnote at B133 about synthetic unity being prior to analytical unity.
Right, that footnote. It seems to flip common sense on its head. Explain that priority.
We usually think we form concepts by noticing common features. We see lots of red things, abstract the redness, and get the analytical concept red.
Seems straightforward.
But Kant says, hold on. To even recognize red as a common mark across different objects or moments, you first need the capacity to hold those different representations together under one single consciousness. You need the synthetic unity, the act of binding diverse perceptions together, before you can perform the analytical act of identifying a common feature within that unified set.
Wow, okay. So the ability to compare analysis depends on the prior ability to combine synthesis under a single I.
Exactly. The synthetic unity provided by the IThink is the logical prerequisite for forming general concepts through analysis.
And this, then, is how Kant gets around Hume's problem about the contentless I.
It's the key. If the I has no empirical content, no features to observe, its identity can't be based on what it is, but only on what it does. Its identity is secured through its consistent activity of synthesis.
So, the fact that I can perform this act of synthetic unity, holding diverse representations together according to rules, is enough to guarantee the identity of the I think performing the act. The unity of the action implies the unity of the actor.
That's the core insight. The synthetic unity required for experience is sufficient ground for cognizing the identity of the self performing the synthesis. My awareness of the necessary connection I forge between representations is my awareness of my own enduring identity.
Okay, hold on. Synthesis gives us unity, sure. But just combining thoughts doesn't automatically make them objective, does it? I can associate rain with sadness in my mind. That's a synthesis. It's unified in my consciousness. But it's purely subjective. It's not an objective truth about rain.
Excellent point. That's precisely the next hurdle Kant has to clear. If the synthesis were purely arbitrary or based on personal whim, that I think might be unified, but it would be a chaotic, subjective unity. We'd be back to the unstable empirical self in a different guise.
So how does he ensure the synthesis isn't just subjective association? How does it become objective and necessary?
Through rules. The critical step is realizing that for the self's unifying activity to be recognizable as the identical activity of the same self across time, that activity can't be random. It must proceed according to necessary universal rules.
So the rules provide the stability and consistency. If the way I combine thoughts followed no set pattern, I couldn't recognize my own thinking process as continuous or identical.
Exactly. The identity of the self isn't just based on doing synthesis, but on doing it in a predictable, rule-governed way. And this is Kant's bombshell claim. These necessary rules are the categories: causality, substance, unity, plurality. These aren't just features of the world, they're the rules the mind must follow to synthesize experience, and in doing so, cognize its own identity.
Self-consciousness requires the categories.
Yeah.
That's huge.
Sure.
My ability to know myself as a single, enduring I depends on my mind structuring experience according to rules like cause and effect.
It's a profound link. And Kant solidifies this by bringing in the concept of the object with capital O in section 17. He defines an object as that in the concept of which the manifold of a given intuition is united.
So the object isn't just a thing out there. It's like the conceptual structure that forces the unity.
In a way, yes. It leads him to talk about the transcendental object XX. This isn't an empirical object we can point to. It's the pure concept of an object in general. It's the formal placeholder, the underlying unity or rule that guarantees our representations relate to something consistent and structured, rather than just floating free in our subjective awareness.
So the transcendental object X is like the anchor point for objectivity. It provides the rule that says, for these representations to count as knowledge of an object, they must be combined in this specific, necessary way, i.e., according to a category.
Precisely. It's the formal condition that ensures our synthesis isn't merely subjective. If representations are to relate to this X, they must conform to the rules, the categories. This allows Kant to draw that sharp line between subjective and objective unity.
Okay, let's clarify that distinction again, sections 18 and 19, right?
Right. Subjective unity is just the flow of my personal consciousness, my associations. Like your rain means sadness, example. It's based on empirical psychological connections. It's contingent, variable, maybe true for me, but not necessarily for anyone else. That's Hume's territory.
It can't ground the necessary identity of the IThink because it's too flimsy, too personal.
Exactly. Contrast that with objective unity. This unity is achieved when representations are combined according to the necessary rules, the categories generated by the common structure of all rational minds. This unity is necessary and universally valid.
And Kant finds evidence for this, right, in our language, in the word is.
It's a brilliant observation. Think about the difference between saying, when I lift the stone, I feel heaviness, versus the stone is heavy.
The first one is about my subjective state. It's psychological.
Right. It describes a connection within my own sequence of representations. But saying, the stone is heavy, that little word is, the copula does something philosophically massive. It claims the representation heavy relates necessarily to the object, the stone, according to a rule, like substance or causality, independent of my current feeling. It asserts objective validity.
It takes the representation out of my purely personal stream and links it to the transcendental object X, making a claim that holds for everyone.
Precisely. The is signifies that the synthesis has been performed according to the categories, achieving objective unity. So the first major part of the deduction, let's say up to section 20, establishes that the categories are the necessary logical functions for any possible objective judgment, for any thinking being that operates with concepts.
Okay. We've got a unified self whose unity and identity depend on synthesizing experience according to necessary rules, the categories, which allows for objective judgment. But there's a huge piece still missing, isn't there?
There is a massive one.
All this talk about understanding and logical rules is very abstract. How does this purely logical structure of the categories actually connect with the stuff of our experience? You know, the actual sights and sounds given to us through our senses, which Kant says always arrive structured by space and time.
Right. The understanding on its own, Kant says, cognizes nothing at all. It's just formal logic. It needs content, material, which comes from sensibility. And our human sensibility has these specific forms, space and time. How do we guarantee that the messy, intuitive data arriving in space and time will actually conform to these clean, logical categories?
You need a bridge. Something has to mediate between the pure logic of the understanding and the spatio-temporal form of our intuitions.
And Kant's bridge is the figurative synthesis, or synthesis speciosa. This is where the faculty of imagination comes in, but in a very specific transcendental role.
Not just picturing things in my head.
No, much deeper than that. This isn't just the reproductive imagination, recalling images, it's the productive imagination. Kant sees it as a fundamental power that links understanding, which is active, spontaneous, and sensibility, which is receptive, but has its own forms, space and time.
So the productive imagination actively generates something.
Yes. It actively generates the pure, unified forms of space and time themselves. It's the faculty that allows us to represent space as a single, infinite, homogeneous whole, and time as a single, continuous flow. All our empirical perceptions must fit into this pre-structured space and time generated by the imagination.
Okay. And how does this connect back to making the self knowable to itself and ensuring intuitions fit the categories? This feels like we're getting closer to the self-identity part again.
We are. This leads to the incredibly important but difficult idea of self-affection. The understanding through the productive imagination actively affects our own inner sense. Inner sense is our awareness of ourselves in time.
The mind acts upon itself. How does that work?
Kant uses the famous example of drawing a line. To represent time, which is inherently successive, you can't just passively receive it. You have to actively generate the succession in your thought. Think about mentally drawing a line in space.
Okay, I'm picturing drawing a line.
That act, that motion of your thought generating the line bit by bit is an action performed by you, the subject. Kant argues that this activity of synthesis, projected onto inner sense, time, is what produces our representation of time as a continuous flow. We become aware of time by being aware of our own unifying action in generating it.
So I don't just perceive time passing. I cognize time because my mind is actively constructing that temporal sequence through its own synthetic activity. The mind makes the timeline it then experiences.
In a crucial sense, yes, it determines the form of inner sense through its own action. This is self-affection. And this figurative synthesis, this active structuring of time by the understanding via the imagination, is the masterstroke.
Why the masterstroke?
Because if the very form of time within which all our inner experiences must occur is itself generated by a rule-governed synthesis originating in the understanding, then any empirical intuition that appears in time must necessarily conform to the conditions of that synthesis.
Ah, so the categories get baked into the very structure of time before any specific experiences happen.
Exactly. The understanding imposes its unity, its rules, onto the form of inner sense itself. Therefore, the manifold of intuition, when it arrives, is guaranteed to be connectable according to the categories, because it's arriving within a temporal framework already structured by them.
Okay, that connects the categories to intuition. Now, how does this solve the problem of knowing the identical self a priori?
Because this process of self-affection allows the self to become aware of its own continuous rule-governed activity over time. Remember, the simple I think of original apperception was just the immediate awareness that I'm thinking. It didn't give me knowledge of myself as an enduring object.
Right, it was just the bare minimum logical requirement.
But now, through figurative synthesis and self-affection, the mind reflects on its own act of generating time and unifying representations within it. It grasps its own enduring identity by grasping the continuity of its synthesizing action. Think of the arrow traversing the line. The arrow, the act of synthesis, remains the same even as the points on the line, the representations change.
So the a priori reflected self-consciousness is this awareness. It's the ability to say, I, the one synthesizing now, am the same I who was synthesizing a moment ago because I recognize the continuous rule-governed process.
Precisely. It's a consciousness of the identity, achieved by reflecting on the unifying activity that constructs the temporal flow of experience. This reflected self is determined a priori. Its identity is guaranteed by the necessary structure of its own activity, not by observing some inner substance. It generates its own temporal horizon.
This is incredibly intricate. We have this self whose identity is known a priori through its own rule-governed activity of synthesizing experience in time, which it partly generates through self-affection. Now, it seems crucial to put up some philosophical guardrails here. How do we avoid misinterpreting this?
Absolutely essential. Kant was building a critical philosophy, not a new metaphysics. We need to be clear about what the self is and isn't.
First, potential confusion. Is this reflected self personal or just some kind of impersonal thinking structure? Some interpretations lean towards impersonality.
Right. The idea that it's just the identity of any rational subject whatsoever. But following Henrich and others, the source material strongly argues it is personal. The key goes back to original apperception.
Because that initial I think is inherently mine. It's got that first-person immediacy built in.
Exactly. The very first awareness, I think, is irreducibly first personal. And the subsequent reflected self-consciousness is achieved by reflecting on my acts of synthesis, my drawing of the line in inner sense. The structure is universal, yes, but the instantiation and the immediate awareness are inescapably mine. You don't start with an impersonal structure and then somehow tack on personality later.
Okay, so it's a necessary and personal identity. Good. Next guardrail. The classic Kantian boundary phenomenon versus noumenon. This self we've constructed, it's the self as we can know it, right? The epistemic self.
Absolutely. The entire transcendental deduction operates within the limits of possible experience. It tells us the necessary conditions for cognizing the self as unified and identical within experience as it appears to us through the lens of our cognitive faculties. It says nothing about the ultimate metaphysical nature of the soul or the self as it is in itself.
So we absolutely cannot jump from I cognize myself as a unified, enduring thinker to, therefore, I am an independently existing, simple, immortal soul substance. That's the error of the paralogisms.
Precisely the error Kant dismantles. He explicitly warns against inferring substance. Invalid inference 1. Just because the I is the logical subject of my thoughts and distinct from the objects I think about, That gives us zero grounds to claim it's a self-subsisting entity.
We don't know if thought is even possible without sensory input, without a world affecting us. So claiming the I as a substance is pure speculation.
It's dogmatic metaphysics, exactly what Kant wants to avoid. We only know the self as the condition for unified experience, not as a thing in itself.
Okay, another potential misstep. Maybe looking forward from Kant. What about the idea that the self only exists when it's actively thinking and aware of itself? Like Fichte's interpretation, the strong apperception thesis, SAT.
Right, the SAT pushes Kant's emphasis on activity to an ontological extreme. It claims the self literally is its activity and exists only insofar as it's conscious of itself and all its representations.
But Kant seems more modest than that, doesn't he? Is he really saying we can't have any unconscious mental states? What about dreams or fleeting thoughts we don't attend to?
Kant's claim is much more specific and epistemic. He's saying that for a representation to become part of cognition, to be integrated into the unified structure of experience and consciously attributed to the self, it must be possible for the IThink to accompany it.
The possibility is key,
Yeah.
not the constant actual awareness of every single mental flicker.
Exactly. He's not making an ontological claim that only fully conscious states exist. He's setting the conditions for what counts as knowledge or experience. If a representation can't potentially be brought under the unity of apperception, it remains nothing for me, cognitively, but that doesn't mean it ceases to exist in some unconscious mental basement. Confusing the condition for knowledge with an ontological statement about all mental life is, again, a dogmatic leap Kant avoids.
So, this carefully constructed a priori, reflected self-personal, epistemic, known through its rule-governed activity in time. This isn't just some abstract achievement for securing knowledge. It has implications beyond epistemology.
Oh, absolutely. It has profound practical significance. The whole structure we've painstakingly built is actually the necessary foundation for the possibility of morality.
How so? Connect the dots for us.
Think about what morality requires. It requires making choices, forming intentions, setting rules for your future behavior, what Kant calls maxims. And crucially, it requires responsibility. You are held accountable for your actions over time.
And if the self were just Hume's bundle of disconnected perceptions?
Then responsibility dissolves. How could you now be responsible for an action performed by a collection of perceptions 5 minutes ago if there's no underlying identical agent connecting the two moments? Moral accountability requires a persistent self.
So the capacity to form a maxim like, I will always tell the truth, requires me to presuppose that the I making this rule now is the same I who will be obligated to follow it tomorrow or next year.
Precisely. The a priori reflected self-consciousness, generated through the figurative synthesis determining the self in time, provides exactly that necessary enduring agent. It establishes the stable I that can project itself into the future and bind itself by rules. Without this determined identical self, the idea of a rational will forming universal laws for itself wouldn't get off the ground.
Wow. So the structure needed for objective knowledge is the very same structure needed for moral agency. The epistemic self is the practical self, viewed from a different angle.
They are inextricably linked in Kant's system. The unity and identity of the self, proven necessary in the deduction for theoretical reason, knowledge, turns out to be the indispensable presupposition for practical reason, morality.
Okay, so stepping back, the transcendental deduction, particularly in this identity deduction reading, it's doing double duty. It's showing how objective judgment is possible because it simultaneously shows how a unified identical self is possible and vice versa.
That's the beauty and the complexity of it. The categories provide the necessary rules for objective synthesis, but those rules only guarantee the identity of the self if the self's activity follows them. And the self can only cognize its own identity through time by reflecting on its rule-governed activity, particularly the figurative synthesis that structures time itself via self-affection.
The two sides require each other. You can't have objective knowledge without a unified self, and you can't have a cognizable unified self without the rule-governed synthesis that constitutes objective knowledge. The self isn't just found. It's actively achieved through the necessary structures of thought.
Exactly. It's a dynamic, reciprocal relationship. The self is constituted by the very activity that constitutes objective experience.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating thought to ponder. We've seen that our very identity, the persistent I that's necessary for both knowledge and morality, isn't some innate soul substance we passively observe. It's achieved through self-affection, the mind acting on its own inner sense, generating its temporal structure according to rules.
Right. It's a product of our own determined activity.
So the final question for you, the listener, is this. What does it truly mean for your understanding of who you are, that your knowledge of yourself as a continuous responsible agent is fundamentally a product of your mind's own necessary rule-governed activity rather than the discovery of something simply given?
If the enduring identity required for moral freedom is actively constructed through the necessary laws of cognition, how does that change the way you think about the relationship between the determined structure of your mind and the possibility of free choice within that structure?
Something deep to reflect on, rooted in the very architecture of thought itself. Thanks for joining us on this very deep dive.